Growing Series podcast, powered by Cargill.
Harvest is well underway in Western Canada, and there are quality challenges to this year's wheat crop. We need to understand the marketing challenges in front of us and the measures we can take to mitigate the risk for next year.
You're listening to the Growing Series podcast, powered by Cargill and presented by Sean Haney and RealAgriculture.com, bringing you timely advice to help you achieve your goals.
Welcome to the Growing Series podcast. Today we're going to talk to Phil Oswald and Mike Morlock from Cargill. Phil is going to talk about the quality of this year's wheat crop and how that's going to impact our marketing decisions. Later, we'll talk to Mike Morlock about some of the best management practices agronomically that you can enable to minimize those quality risks next season. Hey Phil, how is Canada's wheat crop this year? How is the quality looking?
Well, I mean, I think it's we continue to try and anticipate what the last third of it is going to look like. I would say we have a red spring crop that is probably below average in terms of the grade pattern. We have a durum crop that is probably, I would say, in the toughest shape it's ever been. The red spring crop, hopefully if it's 2/3 twos or better, and say 25% threes and 15% feed or something like that is all manageable. I think once you start seeing the feed percent kind of inch up towards 20 and the three red inch up towards 30 and only half of your stuff is 2 or better, then there's going to be some challenges. But I think we'll be able to if we can hold 2/3 of the crop being a 2 or better, then I think we'll be okay. I think the most surprising thing about certainly the wheat is that the protein is a lot higher than I would have guessed, given how the yields are running. We got yields that are running, wouldn't say they're necessarily right up there with what we had in 13, but they're within spitting distance of it. It feels as though there's going to be enough protein around on the spring wheat side that certainly helps.
Well, as you indicated, we've got some quality issues with the wheat crop. How is that going to affect the prices that farmers are going to get at the elevator?
Well, it's always a good question. I mean, the first reaction is there's no milling quality, therefore the price will go higher, which is, at a high level makes sense. So the trouble is there's so much wheat in the world, right? And interestingly enough, there is a lot of poor quality wheat in the world. But what ends up happening is that millers then try and figure out how to use the poor quality, and so the one impact I would say on prices at the elevator for a Canadian farmer is that much of the quality difference between, for lack of a better term, higher quality versus lower quality in the world market is being reflected in the price differential between Minneapolis futures and Kansas City futures. So today, Minneapolis December futures are almost $1 a bushel higher than the Kansas City December futures. And typically, Minneapolis futures would only be, 25 to 50 cents a bushel higher. So to some degree, the quality issues that we're dealing with in Canada are being reflected in the high Minneapolis futures relative to both Kansas City and Chicago.
So Phil, when we look at the elevator, what is the base grade wheat that elevators will even accept?
Well, I mean, I think I would say, again, if we get ourselves into a situation where 2/3 of the crop is 2 or better, then chances are we'll be able to be, we'll probably be able to get some, hopefully blend the threes up to a degree and get them up into a 2. But I think, if you end up with more than 20% of the crop being a 3 red, then there's going to have to be some 3s that get sold outright. Feed wheat will be very situational in terms of the bread wheat. People will be asking, okay, tell me, why is it a feed wheat? Is it feed because of sprouts and the falling number doesn't hold? Is it feed because it's got high VOMI? It becomes extremely situational depending on where you are at a location level. Twos and better, fine. Number ones in and of themselves, there's actually only one customer in the world that, or at least that comes to Canada, that has to absolutely have to have a number one, and that's Japan. And Japan would take 1.25 million tons of wheat out of Canada, which would be less than 10% of the total export number. If you can blend some ones with some threes and make some twos, you're kind of hoping that works, but typically it takes a couple of loads of ones and a load of three to make a two. But again, it'll all be dependent on what the downgrading factors are on the threes.
Well, some of the listeners are probably sitting there saying, well, three, I wish I had a three. What are the options for people that don't meet that 3 grade and they're lower?
Well, I guess you always take a step back and recognize that typically in Canada we're going to be feeding 3 million tons of wheat, say 3 to 4. So we're always going to be, and this year our wheat crop, just our wheat crop, will probably be 24 million tons, say. So we're typically feeding, what is that? 15% of the crop. Now you're going to have logistical constraints that might make things a little bit awkward at times. But it does become what we do have to understand is that the Canadian trade will probably mostly have milling quality sold at least through December, right? Because millers cover themselves certainly 2, if not 3 or 4 months ahead of time. And that, dealing with the lower quality, the feed type quality, you got to get your arms wrapped around why is it feed? Can it be blended up at a certain point in time? But chances are the market can only kind of get itself around to trying how to make this stuff disappear, starting in the new calendar year. So there's always going to have to be a little bit of patience, which is hugely frustrating for everybody. But you got to go find the market. So we talked about earlier that Korea is a huge feed wheat market. They might be 1.0 VOMI, but they are a huge feed wheat market. But they're already covered on feed through into January. So trying to push feed wheat into the market today might be pushing it into a bit of a price hole if too much comes at the market at any given point in time.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask you about is that, we around the world, there's a wheat harvest every month. And you had mentioned earlier that the world is aflush with wheat. When we've got quality concerns like this, how does that world market affect our ability as Canadians to market that wheat abroad?
Well, it never, it's always, you're always approaching the customer when you have wheat quality issues, sometimes with a bit of a but, and often the millers will say, okay, I understand it's lower quality. You know what? I'm going to have to see a bunch of samples here so I can understand exactly how it's going to go across the mill and how the flour is going to react through, once it gets into the baker's hands. The mills right now, today's world milling market is much more adept at moving and switching from one origin to another origin to a third origin, or making their own blends, and much more than they have been in the past. So you do find yourself having to be having to compete with the quality you got, and how does that blend work versus other complexity of the wheat market is that you have to compete against Russian wheat or Ukrainian wheat, in addition to U.S., Australia, European type wheats, and the millers are getting they're much more. They have a much greater ability to mix and match wheats through their mills than they have in the past. So it's just a bit of a process every year, especially if you have quality challenges.
Okay, Phil, thanks a lot for joining us today.
No problem, Sean.
Now that we've heard from Phil about the status of this year's Canadian wheat crop, let's talk to Mike about some of the things that we can do agronomically to mitigate some of the risk from a quality perspective. Okay, Mike, so what are some of the things I can do to get the best quality wheat?
I think quality wheat starts well before the crop goes in the ground. I think traditionally we think about managing crop quality in season with a fungicide application, but I think we need to step back and look at our quality management more holistically, because there's a lot of things we can do before the crop goes in the ground to set us up for good quality come harvest.
Okay, so some of the listeners are probably saying, okay, that's fine, but doesn't it really just depend on the weather?
In the last couple of years, we've seen amazing disease in dry conditions. It really doesn't take much moisture to initiate leaf disease or even fusarium head blight, especially on susceptible varieties.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning then. How important are seed genetics to achieving that higher quality wheat?
You took the words right out of my mouth, Sean. I think this is our single biggest opportunity in the Canadian prairies to improve our wheat quality. I think there's an opportunity to spend the same time on selecting our wheat seed varieties that we spend on selecting our hybrid canola.
Right. So do you think that the issue is that farmers aren't spending enough time trying to figure out what is the best wheat variety for their farm, or those genetics just aren't available yet?
There's a lot we can do with our current genetics, and I think by looking at our variety selection in a little different way, we can set ourselves up for managing our quality once the crop's out of the ground.
Well, before we get that crop out of the ground, what about considering seed treatments to control those seed-borne diseases?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of fantastic seed treatments on the market, and I think the single greatest thing you can do to help manage your fusarium head blight is to ensure that the crop comes out of the ground evenly, and even backing up a little bit and looking at your seed selection. We tend to look at maturity as more of a way to manage the crop come harvest. But I think we also have to look at the variety's maturity when it comes time to time our fungicide spray in season. So the way I look at effective fusarium head blight control, which is probably our biggest economic disease in wheat, we have to look at setting up that head fungicide timing for success. And the single biggest thing we can do to set up that timing for success is ensure that the crop is even when we apply the fungicide. And so, selecting good genetics, looking at maturity, looking at, your disease resistance, including fusarium head blight, is critical in seed variety selection. But to your point, adding a seed treatment and ensuring that crop emerges evenly, tillers evenly, and ultimately heads evenly, sets ourselves up for actually being able to manage our quality, particularly with fusarium head blight.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot of stories specifically from a corn standpoint, as far as, a lot of yield is determined by the evenness of that emergence. So you'd think that your cereal crops like wheat would be very, very similar. Do you think one of the challenges with seed treatments is that they're more of a preventative measure than, say, a reactive measure, like, hey, I see a weed, I need to spray for it?
Absolutely. I think by the time you realize that you should have used a seed treatment, particularly in cold, wet conditions, late, whereas with a post-emergent herbicide, you're making that decision in season, and you have an opportunity to use the best product. Whereas with a seed treatment, you really need to back up and start with a good seed test, and then determine what the best product is to apply to ensure you're controlling any disease inoculum that's on your seed that could affect emergence.
Yeah. So in terms of weed control, what role does controlling weeds properly play in achieving high wheat quality?
When you look at having a consistent maturity across the field, weed control can play a huge role. I mean, it's probably our single largest threat to yield is weeds in most crops, and making sure that you're in early with your weed control so that there's no competition with the wheat crop is critical. And we have so many good options to control weeds and manage resistance in wheat.
And obviously, specifically this year, harvest of 2016, when we talk about wheat quality, we can't go very far without talking about fusarium. How can I reduce that fusarium risk to raise my wheat quality?
Yeah, absolutely. And the obvious answer, Sean, is use a fungicide at heading, that T3 timing. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot we can do to set up that fungicide application for success. I often hear complaints about that T3 fungicide not working, and growers still ending up with significant head blight, and certainly under extreme pressures and optimum timing that can occur. But we get issues because we're both trying to apply the fungicide at heading on large acreage. So, if you're planting the same maturity wheat variety across all your acres, in most years you're going to have your optimum maturity for fusarium head blight timing come on within a few days, and it's next to impossible in most cases to cover all the acres at optimum timing. So spreading out your wheat maturity in the varieties you select is a great first step in starting to make sure you get the most out of your fungicide application. And the other things we can do, I've already mentioned, is make sure that you're doing everything you can to get that crop even, out of the ground even, tillering even, and heading even, so that when you do apply your fusarium fungicide, you've got the best chance of hitting most of the plants at optimum timing. In practice, you may only hit half of those heads when they're in flower, and that's why we end up with poorer control, because the crop's uneven and we aren't hitting it at the optimum time.
One of the things, Mike, is that you're recommending seed good genetics. You're recommending seed treatment. You're recommending good weed control, maybe a fungicide to control the fusarium risk. All of that adds up from a cost perspective to achieve some more revenue. So, is this all worth it?
Good question. You've heard from Phil the value of having a high quality crop in its marketability, and particularly with wheat. If you don't have quality, you don't have a marketable crop, and you can lose significant value in that crop overnight by not doing everything you can to manage quality. And it's really discouraging when you manage a crop through the season to have poor quality come harvest. And so I think there's a number of things we can do to set up the crop for success that do give us a great return on investment for investing in those practices and products.
Well, and put it to you this way, if you don't do those things, you're not really giving yourself much of a chance at all, and you're really just sort of rolling the dice, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we tend to go hard for yield, and definitely, especially when commodity prices are down, you know, yield can fill in a lot of gaps, but particularly in wheat, you have to have that quality, or you're missing a huge part of the equation in growing a successful wheat crop and getting a return on your investment on that crop.
Okay, Mike, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Sean.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Growing Series podcast. I want to really thank our guests today, Phil Oswald and Mike Morlock, for joining us. This is Sean Haney. We'll talk to you again next time on the next episode of Cargill's Growing Series podcast.
You've been listening to the Growing Series podcast, powered by Cargill and presented by Sean Haney and RealAgriculture.com. Cargill's experts are ready to help you make the best decisions for your farm. Find more advice at cargillgrows.ca.